Well, we'll go ahead and get started here right at 6 o'clock. My name is Alex Hughes. I'm the Secretary of the Lafayette Alliance, and I want to welcome all of you to our third speaker series event for this year. I want to start off with a few announcements, but I first want to play a video that has launched onto our YouTube account, and I wanted to show it, I guess, officially for the first time tonight. So if you'll bear with me here, I'm going to share the screen, and we will begin with that.
Lafayette deserves our attention.
This statue of Lafayette is an exact replica of the statue in Lafayette's birthplace of Le Puy, France. It was erected here in LaGrange, Georgia in 1975 to celebrate the bicentennial of the United States.
Lafayette stands for liberty, equality, and justice, the three great ideas we act on. He stands for respect and reciprocity, the two things necessary for a democracy to flourish. He stands for courage and gratitude, the two basic building blocks of character.
The Lafayette Alliance seeks to illuminate, inspire, and unite. All in the spirit of Lafayette.
There we go. So there you are. The launch of the promotional video for the Lafayette Alliance. Quite a bit of drone footage there over the fountain, which had turned out wonderfully. And our two narrators, Katie Steele and our very own Dr. Richard Ingram. So as we begin tonight, I do want to mention those of you who are members of the Lafayette Alliance should have already received your spring edition of the Cockade in the mail. Those of you who are not, feel free to become a member. We'd love to send you one. But you can also view that digitally online at LafayetteLaGrange.org/Cockade-newsletter. I do want to mention that in September, on September 6th, Lafayette Day in Georgia, which we were speaking with Stephanie a moment ago, this year we will have another wreath laying ceremony, and that will be at 10 a.m. at Lafayette Square. For more details on that, you can go to our website, LafayetteLaGrange.org/Lafayette Day 2022. And of course, our website, and we're on every social media account, I think that there is, minus maybe TikTok, but we should add that soon, right? And also want to mention Living Lafayette, a podcast that Dr. Ingram has begun. And the kind of crux, the beginning of this podcast starts with why the Marquis de Lafayette speaks to you today. Why Lafayette should be streaming on every IMAX theater in America. Lafayette can unite a community, your community. Lafayette's 4 philosophies for living life well. So if you want more on that, you can also go to our website, LafayetteLaGrange.org. Go to the education section, and then right under there, you'll see Living Lafayette. And you can view all of the information about that podcast series. Also, you can go to a Lafayette online store. If you haven't read Stephanie's book, then it's there. If you liked it so much you read it twice, maybe 3 times, then and you want to send it to a friend, but you don't want to send them your copy because you never loan copies, right? If you're really a book lover. So then you can purchase the book for one of your friends or your family members there online. And through July 31st, if you use Lafayette Women as the promo code, you can get 40% off on any product in the store. Now, that's something I'm only telling people that are here tonight, and maybe those who will watch the recording between now and July 31st. But thank you for attending, and use Lafayette Women as the promo code. If you want to support the Lafayette Alliance, of course, there's opportunities on our website as well, or you can contact me, Alex at LafayetteLagrange.org, and I'll be happy to set you up with all the information that you need. Without further ado, I want to turn this over to one of our board members, Shannon Gavin Johnson, who is prepared tonight to kind of introduce Stephanie, but also ask questions of her as well once her presentation is done. So I will dissipate to the background where I like to be most of all, and let these two ladies continue.
I will thank you, Alex, first, and I will tell you, I think the reason that I was asked to introduce you, Stephanie, was because I'm a bit of a fan. Not really a bit, I'm a lot of a fan. I really, as I've said before, I've really enjoyed several of your books. But I do think that The Women of Chateau Lafayette has been my favorite. But without further ado, I will introduce you and then turn it over. Stephanie Dray is a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today bestselling author of historical women's fiction. Her award-winning work has been translated into 8 languages and tops lists for most anticipated reads of the year. Before she became a novelist, she was a lawyer and a teacher, and now she lives near Washington, D.C. with her husband and cats and all of her history books. And we are excited that you are with us tonight.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here tonight with other Lafayette lovers. I'm going to do my presentation, but I'm also going to try to be a little bit loose tonight because I know that most of you already know many of the things that I'm going to talk about, and I really am eager to get to the questions. For me, I feel like the Lafayette, both of them, the Lafayettes, carved out a world-changing legacy of civil rights and freedom and democratic ideals, a legacy that forced America to embrace her destiny in World War I with the famous words, "Lafayette, we are here," that was spoken at his gravesite. It's a legacy that inspired the resistance during World War II in France. It's a legacy that still echoes today in marches and debates about our civic future. And it's a legacy to which I pay tribute in my novel, The Women of Chateau Lafayette. Now, when I talk about how it's still sort of echoing today, what's really resonating to me at the moment is what's happening in Ukraine. Very recently, this novel has been translated into more languages because it's sold to several Balkan nations. And that was sort of a surprise to me because it has not sold in France. But maybe it shouldn't have, because those nations, especially since the invasion of Ukraine has reminded us, are right on the edge of remembering what it was like to not have freedom, to not have democracies. And this seems to be a book that is speaking to them. And I really think it's because the Lafayettes are speaking to them. So let's get back to America. For me, when I think of the American Revolution, it always seems to me like we got very lucky. We had, a fortuitous fog in Long Island that helped George Washington. We sort of stumbled across the Hessians in Trenton. It was very fortuitous that we managed to capture the British spy master, John Andre, with proof of Benedict Arnold's treason in his stocking. So I really feel like the founding fathers got a lot of lucky breaks, but the luckiest of all was the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, I am a historical novelist by profession, not a historian. So when I look at history, I'm always looking at it in terms of story and narrative structure. And what was really interesting to me about Lafayette is that he doesn't fit any sort of human character archetypes. To a storyteller, he's almost like a wizard, except with guns and ships and an alliance with France that comes to save the day. It makes him a very attractive figure to write about, but also a very difficult character to write about, especially as a protagonist. Now, I first sort of became fascinated with Lafayette around the time that I started writing a book called America's First Daughter with my dear friend and co-author Laura Camoy. This book was about Thomas Jefferson's eldest daughter, Patsy. And when we were writing this book, we discovered what a touchstone Lafayette was for her in her lifetime. He sort of became a talisman for her. Now, you know, Jefferson and Lafayette were friends, so maybe that isn't so surprising that you would find portraits of him at Monticello. But the last time I visited Monticello, the historians had placed a portrait of Lafayette over Patsy Jefferson's desk in her private office. And the docents explained that she revered him, partially because when she was a little girl on the run with her father in Virginia, it was Lafayette who helped drive the British away and save them. When she was a young woman coming of age in France, it was Lafayette who helped give her entrance into French society. There's also a famous moment in her life when the French Revolution is at a turning point and Lafayette is marching the king back into king and queen into Paris, and he sees Patsy Jefferson up on a balcony, and he tipped his hat to her, and she had a revolutionary cockade with her that she kept from that day for the rest of her life. Then, of course, later in life, when her marriage was falling apart and she was facing some doubt about her own contributions to the revolution, Lafayette's visit in 1824 really lifted her spirits and helped her to make some important life decisions. So it was a real surprise to me and to Laura, really, that Lafayette appeared again in My Dear Hamilton. Not necessarily a surprise because, of course, he was friends with General Hamilton, but what surprised us is that he played a very similar role in the life of Eliza Schuyler Hamilton. So she was the wife of our first Secretary of the Treasury and current Broadway star, and yet we were shocked to find that Eliza Hamilton's friendship with Lafayette long survived her husband, who was shot in a duel, spoiler. And he also appeared in her life at crucial moments to give aid and comfort without really any expectation of reward except for friendship and goodwill. Lafayette appeared again in my next novel, which was Ribbons of Scarlet, which was all about the women of the French Revolution. And I won't get too far into that, but it just always seems to me while writing these revolutionary books that Lafayette is sort of like a Forrest Gump of revolutionary history, popping up in all of my books, changing the plot line wherever he goes, and usually stealing every scene that I write. So at some point, I started researching his wife, Adrienne. And as soon as I learned about her, I knew that she was the founding mother that I wanted to write about next. And I started to think of Adrienne as our French founding mother, even though she never set foot on American soil, because she defended Lafayette's actions, even though he left France to help the American Revolution without telling her. She assisted American envoys like Ben Franklin and John Lawrence in securing the treaty with France and helping to get munitions and additional aid. She considered herself an American, and she took in American awards, including a member of the Oneida Nation. She advanced the ideals of the revolution, including religious freedom and abolition of the slave trade. And she would go on to risk her own life to defend those Enlightenment ideals. Ultimately, she would save her husband's life, which made her the most courageous heroine I had ever encountered. So I was convinced I really wanted to write about this amazing story of love and courage. But now here's a little story that is usually not in my talks. When I told my agent that I wanted to write this story, my agent at the time said, well, you can't write about Adrienne Lafayette. For one, she's not American, and she didn't want to hear my argument about why Adrienne was American. She said she's not American. She wasn't a queen, and she didn't even get her head cut off during the French Revolution. So this is a book that will never sell, and you cannot write it. I want you to shift your energies to World War II, which at that time was sort of the up and coming genre for historical fiction. And now I enjoy historical fiction written in World War II as much as anyone else, but I had never written in World War II, and I was not excited to do so. And I complained to my very good friend, Kate Quinn, who you might know from the Alice Network. She and I were having lunch at Panera, and I said, oh, well, if only I could find some connection between Lafayette and the Nazis, then I'd be all set. And she sort of encouraged me to like keep thinking about that. And I went home and I couldn't let it go. And I thought, well, there can't really be a connection between Lafayette and the Nazis. Can there be? And that's when I stumbled over two things. First, that Lafayette's birthplace had been used as a shelter for Jewish children during the Holocaust. And the second thing being that he inspired a resistant unit in France that, I don't want to say captured Lafayette's statue in Le Puy, of which you have a replica, and spirited it away from the Germans before they could melt it down to make it into ammunition. And my understanding, that really crystallized my understanding that Lafayette is an inspiration. He's an icon. His ideals are carried forth generation after generation. He doesn't just belong to an age of powdered wigs. So that kind of got me excited to write about World War II. But I still had to know, how on earth did Lafayette's house, how did it become a shelter for Jewish children? And so that is when I discovered Beatrice Chandler. Now, Beatrice Chandler was a starlet and an amazing heroine of World War I. She's a decorated heroine. But at the time that I saw her name, when I was doing my research, I remember I was sitting right here and I thought, Beatrice Chandler, why do I know this name? I know this woman from somewhere. And I looked up over my desk where there was a bookshelf, and one of the books on the shelf was by Beatrice Chandler. And I thought, that can't possibly be the same woman. And it was. And I started shrieking because that book was called Cleopatra's Daughter, which is the biography that began my writing career, because my very first novel was about Cleopatra's daughter, and I had based it on her work. So now I felt possessed. I thought, oh my God, there's a guiding spirit here. And I'm not really a woo-woo person, but that was too weird of a coincidence to me. So now I felt like I really needed to write this book, and that I had to understand that it was about the women's legacy who helped support Lafayette and carry the torch forward after his death. So I did go to the castle in Chavignac in 2017. I still remember trekking in the wild mountains there and seeing the dramatic craggy landscape rising around me. And there it was, the chateau standing in these forested mountains in rural France, just like it had for centuries, was Lafayette's birthplace, the site where Adrienne was first arrested and then returned under house arrest and then arrested again after having called additional attention to herself by protecting religious dissidents in Auvergne. And she would almost lose her head for that. So her stand at Chavignac during the French Revolution would have been a remarkable story in and of itself. But knowing that nearly a century later, the colorful Beatrice Chandler would become the moving spirit behind purchasing, renovating, and repurposing the castle as a refuge for sick and disabled children, was really moving. And then, of course, most moving of all was that Jewish children could find sanctuary there because it had been established by another idealist during the World War I, and also that there were heroines in the castle who were helping these children whose names are unfortunately lost to history. And this is where I feel like historical fiction really gets to make a contribution to the historical record in a way that historians really kind of can't, because they can't sort of invent whoever might have been helping at the castle, but I can, and I can bring them to life, which I did with Martha, who is the third character in The Women of Chateau, Lafayette. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Beatrice before we go to questions. Because Beatrice Chandler was a former stage star and had married into a branch of the very wealthy Astor family, I found her frequently mentioned and photographed in old digital newspapers. Yet her amusingly casual relationship with the truth on official documents pretty much became the bane of my existence. On passports and travel records, she frequently changed her name as well as the date and place of her birth. And I was really stymied until I stumbled upon a wonderful article in the Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette, written by Beatrice's grandson and fellow AFL member, William A. Chandler. And so I took a chance and I reached out to Chuck Schwam and I asked for his email, and thus began a heartwarming correspondence between me and Bill. And Bill Chandler, who, like his grandmother, is a really generous soul and an author in his own right, he decided to share family letters with me. And those letters shed a lot of light on Beatrice's personality and her contributions. But they also painted a deceptively simple picture of Beatrice as a rich society maven whose troubled marriage somehow survived the Great War and gave way to remarkable philanthropy at Lafayette's castle. Now, at the start of World War I, Beatrice had been in Paris with her two sons to visit their father at the American hospital, where he was being treated for a mysterious leg injury. And this is still a mystery. The family doesn't know how he was injured. Now, at first, probably presuming the surgery would be over pretty quickly, Beatrice intended to remain in Paris to study sculpture. But by autumn of 1914, it became apparent that she and the boys were now going to be trapped in a war zone. So she evacuated Paris on the very last civilian train, which made a fateful stop at Amiens, where she had the opportunity to speak with wounded soldiers. On the steamship back home, she and her dear friend, American heiress Emily Sloan, they conceived of this new charitable foundation that they would call the Lafayette Fund, that could help those wounded soldiers that Beatrice met. So their first idea was just that they were going to make some kits and send them overseas to the French soldiers. But Beatrice, much like Lafayette, was never one to do anything on a small scale. Her charity would be responsible for sending more than 100,000 Lafayette kits to France. And in a related enterprise, she raised nearly $1 million for the Allies, which would be about $17 million now, give or take. So as a reward for her pains, she was criticized for having violated President Wilson's neutrality policy. But despite leaflets accusing her of this, she just sort of redoubled her efforts. And I think that her belief was that America ought to come to France's aid, in part because of what Lafayette had done in the American Revolution, that a debt was owed. Her nephew, Victor Chapman, also believed this, and he was one of the first Americans to volunteer for service. He'd go on to be a member of the Lafayette Escadrille, and he was the first American aviator to die at war. So for Beatrice, her war relief efforts were deeply personal, but as the wife of a former congressman, she was also a maestro of the political. So she marshaled symbolism like a professional by sponsoring a national Lafayette Day. So that is sort of the genesis of where these started. And she also put on a play, a patriotic play called The Children's Revolution, which starred her own son in the role of Lafayette. Now, she probably hoped that that play would give Theodore Roosevelt a plausibly deniable platform with which to skewer Woodrow Wilson. And that's just what he did. Backstage at the play, while reporters were listening, Roosevelt told the children that we could never be neutral between right and wrong, which I honestly think it might as well have been Lafayette's second motto. So we'll see in the question period whether or not you agree. Certainly that was a credo that appealed to Beatrice Chandler, and it inspired her to purchase Lafayette's birthplace and transform it into an orphanage, a college, and a preventorium for children at risk of tuberculosis, as well as a museum to honor the alliance of Western democracies. Her plans were so ambitious and so expansive that I continually found myself wondering what on earth drove her. I would discover part of the answer amongst 26 unsorted boxes at the New York Historical Society that were filled with her papers. Now, it was there that I discovered a couple of photographs to start with that were of the secret tunnels at Chavignac that I didn't even get to see when I visited. So now I could prove that they existed. I had photographs, which she had helpfully labeled secret tunnels. Pardon me. But I also discovered a cache of love letters that painted a liaison with a French officer. And this was a romance that Beatrice seems to have sacrificed, probably to continue her good works in France. But the third most important thing that I discovered in those unsorted boxes was a family tree that she had been sketching out, probably because she was interested in joining the Daughters of the American Revolution. But I didn't recognize any of the names on this family tree. And so I sent it to Bill Chandler, Beatrice's grandson, and eventually he said that he did recognize one of the names and that it had sent him down a genealogical rabbit hole. And what a rabbit he came out with. He called me one day and he said, I'm really distressed because I have learned that my grandmother was lying about her identity her entire life. And I don't want to give away too much of who she really was, but it was clear that she was a more extraordinary heroine than anyone had realized, certainly me, that she had lived a very difficult life, and she never forgot her childhood, and she sort of paid it back. She wanted to pay it forward and help children who had similarly difficult lives. So in light of all of this, I was really excited to show how Adrienne Lafayette and Beatrice Chandler, how their work culminated in heroism at Lafayette's birthplace and in his name. Imagine my surprise then to discover that most of this period, the most recent period of history at the castle, was actually the one that I had the most trouble learning anything about. Now, communications between the Free Zone and America were possible before 1942, But even then, there were a lot of complaints that I discovered in letters that were passing across the ocean that they hadn't heard anything. The American sponsors of the Lafayette Preventorium hadn't heard anything from them in months, and they didn't even know if the Preventorium was still functioning. So there wasn't really much more information to be gleaned about that, even when I visited the castle. The guides there told me that all the records from the 1940s no longer exist, even though they have plenty of records from other eras. And I came to believe that this was probably because this is a very fraught time period in French history. They were not very comfortable, I think. There were people who worked there who plainly had different loyalties. We know from the diary of, I'm sorry, the memoirs of one of the Jewish children that was saved during the Holocaust at the castle, that at some point, one of the administrators at the castle actually did call the Nazis and tried to turn in 15 Jewish children who had sought shelter there. So that meant that it was always unclear to me while I was researching who was on which side, and that I was going to have to be very cautious because I had overwhelming evidence that heroic acts took place at Chavignac, but I couldn't know who the heroes and heroines were. And so in the end, I had to put together the clues that were left behind and then fictionalize the rest. And again, that's where I feel like historical fiction can really make a contribution, because we can go where historians rightly fear to tread and tell stories that cannot responsibly be told any other way. But I felt like the story of Lafayette's legacy and the women who preserved it was a story that deserved to be told. It's a story that extends beyond the confines of his biography or Adrian's biography. It's a story about a name, Lafayette, that other people invoke while doing important work for human rights. And it's a story that continues, many chapters of which remain unwritten, in which I hope we all play a part. So now I'm really happy and eager to take any questions or chat with you about whatever you'd like.
There we go. I'll start the questions, but I do hope that others have questions. I think I already know the answer to this, but I'd like to know which of the three ladies, Adrian, Beatrice, or Marta, is your favorite and why?
You know, I have to say that my opinion about who my favorite was changed constantly while I was writing the book. And I think it still changes on the daily. So sometimes when I'm feeling particularly sassy, I love Beatrice best, especially since she had so much in common with me. We both love Cleopatra's Daughter. We're both writers. And she gave me such trouble in ferreting out her story that, of course, she's the most appealing in that way. But other days, when I'm really needing bravery or courage, I have to look to Adrian. I mean, she was an amazing heroine. And Marta is when I think of people who, you know, when I think that every ordinary person, myself included, we feel overmatched by the events of the world, especially lately. And knowing that there were nameless people in that castle who were doing extraordinary things and whose names would not be remembered, but they still contributed towards victory during World War II, that makes me love her. So I know it sounds like a cop-out, but I can't answer. Today I'm going to pick Adrian. I've got to talk to all of you, and I'm feeling nervous, so I need courage.
I understand. I still think Beatrice is my favorite. I know that Mrs. Ingram has thoroughly enjoyed the books as well. Do you have any questions, Miss Ingram?
I think since I am not a writer, it was truly amazing to know that this was historical fiction and to not really be able to tell which part was fiction and which part was truth. I loved the comments at the back of the book that were most helpful for sure. But the way it was all integrated was just incredible. I do have to tell you that I would have to cheat periodically, particularly when there was the wreck with Beatrice and her husband. I had to find out what happened. And so I would skip over. But you did an amazing job. And particularly, I have to say thank you for bringing it even forward to today's time when you stepped forward to say, what would Lafayette do with the Ukrainian fiasco?
Yeah.
And with the AFL raising money for that. So I thought that was very telling that was indeed the spirit of Lafayette in today's time.
And I think he'll always continue on that way. And Adrian too. I don't think at least I hope it doesn't end with us.
What do you know? What is Chevignac? What's going on in Chevignac right now?
I'm frequently in correspondence with the caretakers there. I think it is has been reopened. I don't know that they're getting as much tourism as they normally did before the pandemic. Although I'm thinking, it was a retreat for tubercular children. It seems like might be the best place for people in a pandemic to go.
So Stephanie, tell me what happened to the idea of a National Lafayette Day.
Beatrice started it with the help of Theodore Roosevelt, and at first there was a lot of protest against it because she really wanted it to be on the anniversary of the Battle of the Marne, I believe, and so America felt like that was a bit warlike, that we we were taking a side, and then I'm not sure. I think once World War I started, once America's part in World War I began, I think there were other priorities on people's minds and it sort of faded off. So I don't know that anyone tried to revive it until, but now you have one, and we're trying to get one in Maryland, and I would love to see a National Lafayette Day. But it seems pretty difficult to get these 50 states to agree on anything.
For sure.
So I do want to jump in, and we have Megan Flannery who's raised her hand. Megan, I'm going to hit to allow you to talk, and then feel free to ask your question. Oh, for some reason that. Oh. Just a moment.
There she is.
There you are, Megan. Feel free to join us.
She's muted though.
I'm asking you to unmute, and feel free to join us either with video or just audio, whatever. There you are.
Okay. Do you need to? Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Megan.
Oh, yes. No, Stephanie. Oh, I just really enjoyed the novel. It's just, I was always hoping someone would tell Adrian's story, and I do love how you then incorporated the World War I Beatrice and World War II stories in there. That was something I was not expecting. So thank you for doing that. I guess that's all I really want to say. I didn't really have a question, but it's just, I just really admire you for doing that, and yeah, just telling these stories.
Oh, thank you. My next story is going to be about Frances Perkins, who was America's very first female cabinet secretary, and she used to go around wearing a tricorn hat. She was also a big fan of Lafayette and various revolutionary figures. So I'm still doing it, and that book I just finished, and now I am beginning my next one, which is going to be about Abigail Adams. So Lafayette will again be a special guest star in the novel. And I'll be curious to see what Abigail thinks about him. She was a very tart founding mother, so we shall see.
I'm noting that in my mind, and I'm sure Dr. Ingram is too. We'll have to invite you back once that book is out.
Thank you.
So Stephanie, may I also ask why this is a compelling story? Why do you think this doesn't resonate in France any more than it does?
So it hasn't found a French publisher, in part because, and that's the way publishing novels at this from my company, my publisher works, is that they'll do North American rights, and then other publishers in other countries will ask for rights to publish in their language. And French publishers tend to, all right, I'm just going to be undiplomatic and say they tend to frown on Americans telling their history. And I'm sympathetic to that. I understand that. But I feel like this is a story that would make them proud, and that I would love for them to look at it. So it's been popular amongst the English speakers in and around Chavignac. I did a presentation there for the castle, and they're really, excited about it and happy about it. So I think it would resonate with other French people, but they just haven't had a chance to see it. And unfortunately, I do not own the rights to translate it into French myself and publish it myself. So it lingers. But I've been very pleased by Central and Eastern Europe. I never expected to get, calls from Bulgaria and Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, but these readers are I guess they're feeling in need of Lafayette's inspiration in a time when they feel pretty threatened.
That's inspiring, Stephanie, and I will say that I've read about half the book. I need to keep going. I've had some other things I had to read, but I've really enjoyed it. One, because I think sometimes I work all day with history stuff, and I go home and read more nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And picking your book up has been nice and enjoyable. And I really, this element that you're talking about of going where historians really ought not go, it is for me has been refreshing, and so I've enjoyed it as well. But
well, thank you. I think historians must go there in their heads. They can't maybe do it in their scholarship. And so I really love when I come up with a theory and a historian tells me, oh, that's what I really think actually happened. And I really struggled in a lot of ways with Adrienne surrounding Lafayette's infidelities, because I knew if I portrayed them the way her biographer portrays them, I did not think American women were going to appreciate that or even believe it, because Adrienne's biographers essentially say, oh, she was totally fine with it. Oh, yeah, that's just a French thing. And the occasional biographer might say, well, actually, there is some evidence that she might not have been totally thrilled with this idea. And so it was a really fine, it was like a needle that I had to thread here. I had to be true to the fact that he was unfaithful. I had to be true to the fact that it may not have been a big deal to her after a while. But it always struck me as interesting that his first mistress was utterly ruined really ruined. And that Adrian's family had apparently been extremely disapproving. And I thought, well, why would they be so disapproving? They all have mistresses. What's the problem here? Unless, of course, Adrian is upset and she has protective parents. So I tried to, I had to invent that sort of scene in the carriage where Adrian has to confront his mistress. And that's, obviously it's fiction. And I know some readers get very upset. Like, how could you just invent a scene in a carriage? But that's the art form. That is what my job is, because you can read about all the other things in the biography. I need to bring it to life in a way that will make sense to contemporary readers. And it's a little bit like being a detective and then coming up with sort of a theory of the case. So that's what historical fiction gets to add to the discussion. And if another historical fiction author wants to write about Adrian as being polyamorous, and that's a valid interpretation, and they can run with it. But I try to do my best to make it real for readers.
It was.
So can we drill down on that? I'm
Yeah.
curious about that. You spent a lot of time with Adrian, with your stage. So as far as I can tell, there were two serious relationships that Lafayette had.
Yes.
But what was your take on Adrian's perception of those, and did it change over time?
My feeling is that Diane, oh my gosh, I can't pronounce her last name, but you know who I'm speaking of, the second mistress that he kept friendly with all of his life.
Simeon.
Thank you.
Simeon, yes.
Yeah, she, Adrian seems to have actually liked her quite a bit, and they had tea together even when Lafayette was not there. And how scary must that have been for him? Oh, your wife and your mistress are having tea together. You know who they're going to be talking about. So I think, she must have made peace with this at some point. But I also feel as if that relationship was not always sexual. I think perhaps it began that way, but over time, it seems pretty clear to me that Lafayette kept her as a very close friend and intimate. But I noticed that when it was a letter, I want to say it was to Jefferson, but I don't think that's right. In one of Lafayette's letters, he essentially says, I'm going to talk about the loves of my life. There were two, but really, I just want to talk about the real love of my life, Adrian, my wife of, I think it was 32 years. And so at some point, I think he let that go. And if I had to guess, the minute Adrian walked into his prison cell, I think that was it for him. It's hard to compete with that kind of gesture. Do you have a theory about it?
Oh, no, ma'am. I have not studied it as much as you have, and I appreciate your take on it. I don't see how she could not have been bothered by it. I want to study that a bit more, but I think she was a stoic kind, and,
Yes.
and I sense that that's your perception as well, and that over time it was it's the way boys are. It was that sort of attitude, and she set priorities, and her priorities were grander than these liaisons that he had. It's sort of my take on things.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think too that she could not have failed to notice that the queen took a whole lot of heat that would normally have gone to a king's mistress. The shallow hatreds and competitions of the court usually aim on whoever the favorite is, and the wife sort of stays above the fray. But Louis didn't have a mistress, and his queen paid a pretty heavy price for that kind of hatred. And maybe she'd have been hated anyway because she was Austrian, but I think there was a good chance she'd be hated a lot less if there had been some other woman to be the target of popular misogyny. So I think Adrienne was very astute, and she probably noticed that. And she probably also noticed that Lafayette was super young when the country started throwing women in his lap. And I feel like it might have been a hard thing for a 21-year-old guy to resist in any time period, when the nation is all but saying, hey, have an affair, you're owed one. So maybe she was emotionally intelligent enough to sort of forgive him for that kind of lapse.
I think she was very, I think you have a good point. I think she was very insightful, and that she learned Lafayette well. And then too, there's always the story about Lafayette. I mean, at 17 years old, he is to dance with Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
He is very awkward. He missteps. She backs off, laughs at him, and everybody else laughs. If I remember when I was 17, if I got laughed at, it was near the end of the world.
Oh, that's going to sting. It's going to leave a mark. Yeah. In
So
fact, I think that laughter might be responsible for winning the revolution.
Well, you need to expound upon that.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
If Marie Antoinette did not laugh at Lafayette and make him even more awkward at court and have no place there, perhaps he would not have gotten on that ship and come to America to make his reputation.
See, you've got a good subject for an essay right there. We invite you. Alex, I'm sure, is preparing to invite you to write the essay on that topic for the cockade next time. There you go.
About August 1st, and I'll make the next one.
Right.
So are there questions that the group has, or should I just expound upon my interest in Lafayette and what we're doing in the AFL still? I guess, well, you know what though? We get the Gazette for that, so I won't use that time. But I will ask, like, do you guys have a book club? Do you like to read historical fiction? Who else is following me?
I think a book club might be a good addition to Lafayette Alliance. We might need to consider that.
And who is the next speaker after me?
Alan Hoffman. You may know.
Our esteemed president. Excellent.
And as I was saying, in next year in June, 8th through the 11th, I'm starting to memorize it now. Dr. Ingram's memorized it for 2 years. I mean, I think on his every jog in the morning, he's memorized the schedule for it, and it's changed 3 or 4 times. But we are inviting the AFL, or we will have the AFL here for the annual meeting. And so I was saying, hopefully you'll be able to come.
I would love that. And I also wanted to mention that I loved the video that you introduced at the beginning of the talk. I thought that was wonderful.
Well, thank you.
And I'm so glad that statue did not get melted down for bullets. Do we know if the reproduction was made before or after World War II?
After, I'll let Dr. Ingram, he's a little bit more of an expert of this, but it was erected in 1975, so it was a little bit before that they were doing the replica. But I'll let Dr.
So if they had melted it down, you wouldn't have that.
I'd have a statue.
That's been a big problem. So Stephanie, that is a remarkable story about how that statue came to be in west central Georgia, LaGrange, Georgia. So it's a cast iron copy. But there is a grand story about how that came to be, and that was one man's vision that had that. And that man was he was president of the college here, LaGrange College, which is a 4-year liberal arts institution. Mm-hmm. But he was president. Waits Henry was president, and he wondered about how LaGrange got to have its name, and then that started him on this cascade of exploration. And he
as
found
it does
out about
all of us. Yeah.
He was in his way doing research just like you do, and he was fascinated by what he found. And then he came upon this statue in Le Puy-en-Velay, and he said, LaGrange, Georgia needs a statue in the middle of town in its major public square. And then he made it happen. And then how the dynamics, because the French, they have quite a bureaucracy, I'm sure you're aware, and they admit that as well. But he had to cut through that bureaucracy in order to get a cast iron copy of that statue and then to get it mounted here in LaGrange, Georgia. It is quite a story. And if you will come and visit with us next June, we'll tell you the details of that story.
Okay, I love that. I'm looking forward to it. And I want to say that something I love about that statue is that, you know, we see lots of statues of Lafayette, and he was a warrior, and there's no reason that we shouldn't see him with sword in hand. He wasn't a conqueror, he was a liberator. But this statue, he's just holding a cockade. And that's really kind of beautiful. Here's a great warrior, but the statue is honoring this part of his life where he's a statesman and he's an icon of liberty. And even the cockade itself, by weaving together the colors of Paris and of the monarchy together, Lafayette is trying to make peace. He's trying to pull people together in common purpose. And, you know, when I was in France, we would talk to people like the cabbies and everyone, and none of them seemed to know that Lafayette was behind their flag or what his contributions were. I even had one cabbie say something like, Lafayette, is he the guy who started the shopping mall? I was pretty sure he was not. But I think that's why I love that statue more than any of the other statues of Lafayette. So it's wonderful that you have it in your town square.
And you bring up a very compelling point. You're very insightful. So his holding up that cockade in his right hand, he is calling attention to it and the unity that it symbolizes. It's interesting that Lloyd Kramer, who's written a grand book, and I've told him about that, about Lafayette, but he writes about Lafayette and symbols and symbolic gestures. And Lafayette had a feel, that was theater, and Lafayette had a feel for it. He had his finger on the pulse of it. And that cockade, one of his designs to try to unify the people of Paris. I think you're very right that his lifting that cockade in his hand. And it's interesting that a lot of folks, they don't know what he's got in that right hand. So we hope to get that message out a little bit more.
Yeah, because I loved that one of the words that you had in the video was unity, or was it unite or unity?
Unity.
And boy, you know, we need that right now badly.
Yeah, and he's an inspiration. He and Adrienne, it's also interesting you point out Adrienne and her courage. Andre Moreau, who wrote a biography, I'm sure that you read about Adrienne. But in his preface, it's curious that he says after studying Adrienne, he did not know that much about her. For 30 years, he knew Renee Chambron, who was, but he said he didn't know that much about Adrienne. And when he found out about Adrienne, he says in his preface, Adrienne is one of the most compelling characters in all history. And this is a man who wrote about Disraeli, he wrote about Charles Dickens. I mean, he knew about character and courage, and he said Adrienne was right at the top of that list.
She certainly was for me. She inspired the book. She sent me down this rabbit hole and to all these discoveries of these wonderful women who followed after her. And even as courageous as they were, none of them really match her. I've told my husband I love him dearly, and I like to think that I would join him in a prison, but it would give me pause. It would certainly give me pause. So on that note, I would like, oh yes, go ahead.
More, so I wasn't watching the Q&A as much as I should have. And actually, never mind. There we are. So, well, that ends our time, and we want to thank you, Stephanie, on behalf of the Lafayette Alliance and all of us. This was enjoyable, and we were very, very glad to have you. And I will probably send a few emails to you to try to get you down next June, or this upcoming June, and to see us here in LaGrange.
Okay, take care. Mwah.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.